Hello, Matthew Stucky here from Verity Baptist Church Manila and Verity Baptist Church Pampanga. Just making a quick video addressing the subject of, was Martin Luther a Calvinist? Was Martin Luther a Calvinist? Now, this is a very common question that people debate about. So to find out whether or not Martin Luther was a Calvinist or not, you really have to kind of read his writings to figure these things out. Now, I've actually done a lot of research on Martin Luther because the Protestant Reformation is a topic that's really interesting to me. And so I've read the entire commentary from the book of Galatians and the book of Romans from Martin Luther. I've read his book, The Jews and Their Lies. And I read another very famous book, not all of it, but because it's a very long book, but some of it, called The Bondage of the Will by Martin Luther. And I'll talk about that here in a second. And, I'd recommend, if you want to double check me on that, you're welcome to read it. I've read not half of it, probably a third of the book of The Bondage of the Will. I want to finish it, but it's a long book, and I'd rather read books by, godly people rather than heretics. So I haven't.
Hello, Jeff Dollard here. We're going to try to throw a video together today based on the question that Mr. Stucky asked: was Martin Luther a Calvinist? Now, obviously, as Mr. Stucky points out, Luther came before Calvin. So it would be difficult to say he was a Calvinist. I think Calvin was a little boy when Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. What we do see is that Luther held a lot of the Calvinistic principles, where Calvin, his theology was later developed into the 5 points. There was no such thing at that point of history. The thing to remember about Luther was Luther came out of great darkness. Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was completely dedicated to the Roman Church. He was seeking to save his soul within the Roman Church. Perhaps you've heard the story. Luther is going to law school. His father was involved in the mining industry, the copper mining, I think it was smelting in particular, and he was able to afford to send his son to school. Luther was an academic genius. He was quite a student. His father had great plans for him, but as he's traveling from one point to another during a storm, he's walking, and lightning struck very near to him and frightened him so much that he promised that if God spared his life, and he cried out to Saint Anne, actually, if you'd spare my life, I'll be a monk. Well, he then gave up all of his law studies, got rid of his guitar, and joined the Augustinian order. He was searching to find a way to save his soul. He knew that he was a sinner. He could not save himself. He attempted to in many, many ways as a monk, and he had made the statement that if anybody could have been saved by monkery, it would have been me. Luther was one that was very sensitive to sin. He would spend hours in the confessional over the smallest details. Sometimes his confessors would tell him, please, Martin, go away, and when you have real sins to confess, come back. So you get the idea of what this man was going through. He felt like that he was condemned to hell. It got to the point where he actually said that he hated God, that God was somebody who wanted to destroy him. He saw no hope in that. Of course, later he came to realize that it was not his own righteousness that would save him. Even prior to that, he went to Rome. He was sent to Rome on a mission with his order, with another monk. He got to see all of the splendors of Rome. He went up the famous steps, saying a prayer on each step. He got to see the Pope himself, I believe. He went around at all the different things that would help him get time off of purgatory. But he also saw the wickedness of Rome. He saw the idolatry, the commercialism, where there are vendors in the street selling all these holy items, as if they were slabs of meat. The monks who were going in to consort with prostitutes, and all that was the priests. The horrible immoralities of Rome, that did much more harm to him than good. It wasn't until his superior, I can't remember the fellow's name, recommended that he teach the book. I don't know if it was specifically the book of Romans, but he was sent to teach the scriptures. And as he was teaching the scriptures, he came across in the book of Romans the idea that the just shall live by faith. And from that, he began to deduce that it's not my righteousness, but God's righteousness that saves through Jesus Christ. So that's just a Luther in a nutshell. But Luther came out of great darkness. And I'm greatly pleased and ecstatic that Mr. Stucky would recommend the writings of Luther. I've used some of Luther's commentaries as Romans and Galatians. I've also read some of his other works. It's very difficult to read. Remember, Luther is writing from a perspective of over 500 years ago. The 15, well, it would be over 500 years ago, approximately half a millennium ago. So you have to go through a lot of cultural deciphering to see what he's getting at. There's a lot more of the quoting of the fathers and the quoting of the philosophers and things as you go through his writings. So you have to decipher through that. And you also have to realize that Luther was always in a state of a progression. He nails his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. That was not a declaration of Protestantism. He just simply wanted to debate certain issues within the church. That eventually became the reason that he was forced out of the church. He did not willingly leave the church. He was forced out. The papal bull excommunicated him. And of course, you have the stand at Worms, all of that, where he's confronted with the fact, are these your writings? Yes or no? He said yes. Do you renounce them? Do you recant? And he gave that famous speech, where he says, I can do no other, here I stand, that kind of a thing. So you see, Luther was quite a pivotal person within history. Remember the great darkness of Rome. You had Wycliffe before him in England. Wycliffe's translation of the Bible and his writings, which came into Europe, into Bohemia, which influenced John Huss, who was burned at the stake. Huss made the famous prediction at his burning that his name meant goose. It says you're going to cook a goose, but someday there'll be a swan you won't be able to kill. And that swan was representative of Martin Luther. As we came to find out later, I think on his family crest was a swan. So that was an interesting prediction by Huss. But regardless, the question here is Luther's writing, The Bondage of the Will. Mr. Stucky recommends that in a sense, that look at it for yourself. And what he's doing, and we'll get back into his video here briefly, he's comparing Martin Luther's book on the bondage of the will to Erasmus's dissertation on the freedom of the will. And again, it's been years since I've read The Bondage of the Will, and I have briefly looked at Erasmus's work. But I'd like to just take a look at that. We'll let Mr. Stucky make a few more points, and we'll come back for some comments.
About that here in a second. But I want you to understand that in 1524, there's a man by the name of Erasmus who wrote a book called The Freedom of the Will. Now, Erasmus, you might know his name because he was very, very famous and important in terms of getting the Bible into the English language. He putting out the Bible in the Greek language was kind of a forerunner to help us eventually get the King James in the English language. And Erasmus was a Catholic, but he was trying to reform the Catholic Church from within. Martin Luther left the Catholic Church. It was trying to reform it from without. So instead of being able to be friends and working together, they actually became enemies from one another. But in 1520...
Martin Luther would not have been considered each other enemies. Martin Luther made this statement in his book concerning his writing in his introduction to Erasmus regarding the issue of the bondage of the will. He says, "And who knows but that God may even consent to visit you, my friend Erasmus, by me, his poor weak vessel, that I may, which from my heart I desire of the Father of mercies through Jesus Christ our Lord, come unto you by this book in a happy hour and gain over a dearest brother." So Luther was by no means the enemy of Erasmus. Luther considered Erasmus a fellow laborer in many ways. But I think that it's very difficult for a person with an IFB background to understand that a person can have a difference of opinion in theology and not be an enemy. I think that's one thing that Mr. Stucky is having to come to grips with in the IFB, new IFB movement. If you take an opposite position to that movement, then you're basically an enemy, as how they treat the Calvinists today. The Calvinists are, except of course you have the issue with Stephen Anderson and his Calvinistic friend, which is causing some stir there. But for the most part, if you take an opposite position of the IFB, new IFB, then you have become their enemy. Let's take another look at some of the stuff he's saying here.
But in 1524, Erasmus wrote a book called The Freedom of the Will. The Freedom of the Will. Basically saying we have free will. And so then the next year, in 1525, Martin Luther wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will. The Bondage of the Will. Now, just from the title alone, that should kind of give you an idea what was Martin Luther's ideas about free will. I mean, he wrote an entire book to blast the position of having free will. And so in the book of The Bondage of the Will, there's quote after quote after quote where he's talking about how you cannot come to Christ unless you're drawn and the Spirit brings you. And he clearly would have agreed with most of the points and the sovereignty of God and how you cannot become saved on your own. You can't do it. You've got to be chosen. He did not believe you had the free will. That's what the entire book was about. Now, this was a very...
So just briefly looking at this character of Erasmus. Erasmus was what they called a humanist. Now, the humanist today is much different. You think of humanism, you think of godless humanism, secular humanism. Humanism, in defining itself in those days, would have been a democratic and ethical life stance that affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. Erasmus was one who believed in that. He believed in that in the context of the church, of religion, that you didn't cast off the faith in order to maintain or to gain those goals of making a person actually mean something and not just be a cog in the religious system or the state. Back in those days, that's all an individual was just a cog in the machinery of the state or the church. He did not believe that, and so he's called a humanist. But however, Erasmus was still loyal to the Pope. Now, he was a reformer from within, as Mr. Stucky points out, but he was very adamant in staying with the church. Luther, on the other hand, found himself kicked out of the church. His diatribe on free will was extremely important to the church. Rome depended on this doctrine of free will in pushing the idea of working for your own righteousness. Now, just as kind of a brief note, I wanted to point out what was Luther's opinion of Erasmus's diatribe. He read it, he was very familiar with it, he knew of its existence, but he did not answer it. He refused to answer it for quite a while. It was others who convinced Luther to finally answer this. And Luther has an opinion on why he did not answer. And I think it's very telling. Luther's opinion, let's see if I can find the notes. Okay, here it is. Luther was more or less coerced by his friends to answer. He didn't think it was worthy of an answer. But one thing he did think was that if somebody of the stature of Erasmus would write such a horrible diatribe against the bondage of the will, it just proved his position. Let me read this. For although you think and write concerning free will, yet no small thanks are due unto you from me, in that you have rendered my own sentiments far more strongly confirmed from my seeing the cause of free will handled by all the powers of such and so great talents, and so far from being bettered, left worse than it was before, which leaves an evident proof that free will is a downright lie, and that, like the woman in the gospel, the more it is taken in hands by physicians, the worse it is made. Therefore, the greater thanks will be rendered to you by me, if you by me gain more information, as I have gained by you more confirmation. But each is the gift of God, and not the work of our own endeavors. In other words, Martin Luther looked at how Erasmus handled this issue of the free will, and he said, this confirms my position. For if somebody of the great stature of Erasmus is just putting out such tripe against the idea of the bondage of the will, then it really confirms my position. But as I was saying, the position of free will was very important to Rome, because Rome its system depended on the idea of being able to work for your own righteousness. there's two types of righteousness. The Protestant view of righteousness is imputed righteousness. The only righteousness we have comes from an outside source. It's alien to humanity. That's the righteousness of Christ. It's on that righteousness that we are justified, not our own righteousness. Rome depends on a righteousness which is something that you earn, or an inherent righteousness. It's a righteousness that you are actually righteous, and God looks at you, and through your works, through your obedience to the commandments, through your going to Mass and buying of indulgences or whatever else the church is telling you, you are gaining merit. You are getting a merit that is actually righteousness, and you are then judged by God on this righteousness which is yours. If you don't have free will, you cannot get that. You cannot gain that righteousness. So the whole system of Rome depended on that, and Luther even recognized that. And I couldn't find the quote in the book, but I've heard it quoted by others, that Luther thanked Erasmus for pointing this out, because this issue was the real core issue of the Reformation. Does man have the ability to earn his favor with God, to gain any favor with God? Luther asserted that he does not. Erasmus was saying man's will was free, that he could. And that was the real crux of the Reformation. What was the whole controversy swirled around this one issue, according to Luther. And he thanked Erasmus for pointing that out. So then, if the will is bound, it cannot participate in the works that would gain righteousness for salvation. If you recall in history, we have William Tyndale. You may be familiar with the Bible translator. He suffered at the hands of Rome once he was captured. He had already translated the New Testament, was working on the Old Testament. When they finally caught up with him, he was burned at the stake. He was first strangled and burned at the stake. There was a list of things a list of crimes that he had committed against Rome and the state. One of them was that he asserted this doctrine of the free will, because it was so important to Rome that free will exists. And so it is with the NIFB. This whole battle that between the bondage of the will and the freedom of the will is very important to the new IFB and any other evangelical church which holds to this, because their system depends on it as well. In their teaching, it's 99% God, or 95% God, or when you look at it. But it all depends on that little percentage which you participate. You've got to respond, and you have to have the ability to respond. And so whether or not you're saved depends on your response. And that response comes entirely from yourself, from your own will. The whole evangelical system, their evangelistic methods and results which they publish depend upon the doctrine of the free will. So then, in studying this issue, the NIFB and the Roman Catholic Church are in complete agreement against the Protestant Church, the historic Protestant Church, that free will is an extremely important position. Now, one thing I'd like you to notice, and we'll kind of go back and show this one little phrase by Mr. Stucky, and we will then make a comment on that as well.
Of having free will. And so in the book of The Bondage of the Will, there's quote after quote after quote where he's talking about how you cannot come to Christ unless you're drawn and the Spirit brings you. And he clearly would have agreed.
Let me just add that it wasn't Martin Luther that said somebody had to be drawn by the Father in order to come to Christ. That was the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So let's just make a brief note of that before we move on.
Baptism. And so when you really look at Martin Luther's beliefs, it's worse than Calvinism. I mean, it's a really bizarre, I believe he was the biggest, Christian heretic who ever lived. That's my opinion. He wanted to take books out of the Bible, a really weird view on salvation.
And then finally, with Mr. Stucky's closing, where he puts Luther among the worst of the Christian heretics. Once again, he is in complete agreement with Rome. The arch-heretic of the Roman Church is Martin Luther. Now, remember, we're not in complete agreement with Luther, or we wouldn't be. Luther came out of great darkness. Luther held on to certain Roman aspects of communion. He couldn't give up the fact that Christ wasn't present in the communion in a literal way. He had to come up with some ideas as to how to explain that. They had this meeting of the reformers, and there were reformers that would say, no, Christ is not present bodily in the communion. Luther slams his fist on the table, and I believe he said something like hoc est corpus. My Latin might not be correct there, but this is my body. This is my body. And he insisted on that. And Lutherans came up with an idea of consubstantiation, which is not flat out Roman transubstantiation, but in some way, mysterious way, Christ is bodily present there. Of course, the Reformation, the later reformers, and even during that time, they were discussing Christ is present only spiritually. He's not present bodily. He can't be present bodily because his body is in heaven with the Father, at the right hand of the Father right now. So we have this issue. Luther couldn't give that up. Luther kept all the vestments and the religious ceremonies. They didn't want to give that up. He felt like it would be too much of a change for the people to be able to adapt to. So they kept that part of Luther. You'll see that Lutheranism today is very similar to Roman worship. When you walk in, if you walked in, I have a Lutheran pastor friend that I need to probably sit down and discuss some of these things, which I wish I would have before we made the video. Luther has a confusing view of baptism. He asserts it's salvation by grace through faith alone, but then when you read some of his writings on baptism, there's confusion. Remember the darkness that Luther came out of. So these things were much more clearly worked through with the next generation. And when you got to the time of Calvin and others, and then after Calvin, at the time of the Puritans, there was this continual reforming and working through the theology and shedding of the darkness which they had come out of. So that is the explanation of that. So Luther was not the great heretic, I believe, that Mr. Stucky tries to make him out to be. And I do strongly recommend that you read his writings, though it's, as I mentioned, it's going to be difficult. He's writing from that perspective of coming out of the Middle Ages. He is sometimes difficult to understand in that degree. And if you're using him for commentary, I would just briefly, you could read and learn from his commentaries, but I would also have other commentaries that are of more of a clearer nature than Luther. Once again, the new IFB takes the position of the Roman Church on the idea of free will and Martin Luther. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. May the Lord bless you in your search for truth.